If you try to start your lending business before watching this video, you are setting yourself up for a whole lot of work and a whole lot of nothing for your results. Here's the problem. Pitching your lending business to the wrong person is like trying to explain AI to your parents. You're just wasting your time. Over the past year, I've done over 160 short-term lending transactions with every type of investor imaginable. And in this video, I'm going to be breaking down for you the different types of short-term lending and the different investors who can use those things so that when you're doing your outreach trying to generate leads, you're not just out there wasting time. You're actually talking to the right people and saying the right thing. Let's start with EMD. So there's actually only two types of real estate investor, right? You've got number one right here, and that's your wholesaler. And then the only other kind of real estate investor is right here, and that is your buyer, right? Every transaction that you do, whether you're lending or anything else, you're either going to be working with the wholesaler or the buyer on the real estate transaction. Now, on the other side, there's three types of transactional lending that we're going to talk about today for our wholesaler and our buyer. We've got EMD, double close, and then finally, and the one I've talked the least about, is known as the Morby method. Now the question for this video will be breaking down for you guys which of these types of investors works with these three types of deals, right? We've got the Morby methods, the double close, and the EMD, and then we've got a wholesaler and a buyer to work on them. So let's start with each type of transaction and break down who you're going to be working with and in what situation. For the first lending type, let's start with EMD. Now on EMD, interestingly enough, you've got both a wholesaler and a buyer that you can work with on these transactions. And the reason for that is because EMD is used to legitimize every single real estate transaction ever. It is always required, whether you are wholesaling or buying, because theoretically speaking and logically speaking, a wholesaler is acting as a buyer on the front end. Now, that being said, there's obviously going to be some differences between lending EMD for a wholesaler and lending EMD for a buyer, and you need to understand which is which so that you know how to pitch to those people and you know who they are before trying to create a relationship and make money with them. So, our wholesaler and our buyer. Our wholesaler is always going to be on the front end, right? The wholesaler is the one that finds the property. So, if they find a house and it's going to be 500 grand, then the wholesaler might come in and do a $5,000 EMD, right? Now, what is important about this EMD? Well, because the wholesaler is direct with either the seller or the agent on a typical transaction, that means there's a high likelihood that that wholesaler's EMD is refundable, meaning you can get that money back. Now, being that you are a lender, this is always something you're looking for, right? You want the money to be refundable so that if you lend it out and something goes wrong, which it often does, you can get the money back, right? And so our wholesale situation right here where they have a 5K EMD, you can fund that money and it will be refundable as long as you check the contract and get everything in place, right? The likelihood of EMD being refundable with the wholesaler within the inspection period is incredibly high. Now, on the other hand, we've got our buyer. Now, a buyer can do two different things, which is very important to understand. It's important to understand what type of buyer you're talking to. A lot of buyers want to buy houses from wholesalers, right? Because then they don't have to go look for it. If you've wholesaled before, or if you're actively wholesaling, you know it's an absolute grind. And if you're a buyer, you have money, you're trying to go out and do something, you don't want to focus and spend all of your time on that because it takes forever. So don't, right? You want to make sure that you are buying from a wholesaler in that scenario. And so what happens is instead of them going and finding a new $500,000 house, they're just going to take this $500,000 house from the wholesaler, which means in that scenario, they're going to do their own EMD. Typically, let's say it's about $7 grand. And the reason why this EMD is higher than this EMD is because this wholesaler wants to make sure that this EMD is higher than theirs so that if anything were to go wrong, they get this money and they don't lose anything. They actually make money even if things go south. Now, in order to do that, they create a contract with the end buyer where the earnest money is what's called non-refundable, meaning no matter what, you cannot get the money back. And that's their way of protecting themselves. Now, that's great for the wholesaler, but what does it mean for you as the lender? Well, if somebody comes to you and asks for this $7,000 and they're buying a deal from the wholesaler and it's non-refundable, then you have two choices. You either lend them that money and potentially put yourself at very high risk of losing it because If they had the money to pay you back, they probably wouldn't have asked you to lend it in the first place, and there's nothing else protecting the money. That's option number one. If you're risky, I've been there, I don't do that anymore. The other option is you can't fund that money because it's not refundable, right? So you say, oh, actually, I can't fund your money, it's non-refundable, I don't do that stuff. That's the first thing that you should be thinking of when you're working with a buyer, right? When you're working with a wholesaler, typically refundable. When you're working with a buyer, it's typically not. However, there is a second scenario here, and that's that instead of buying off of this wholesaler, the buyer goes and finds their own $500,000 house. Now, if the buyer goes and finds their own $500,000 house, now they're in a scenario where they can put their own earnest money down, right? They are direct to the seller. They are direct to the agent, meaning that instead of the $7K EMD, they might now have a $5,000 EMD. And therefore, it could very well be refundable, meaning that you could fund the deal. However, if it's a buyer, the refundable portion is only going to go for typically the first 10 to 14 days of the transaction, and a transaction usually lasts at least 30 days before it closes, meaning that your money won't be protected the entire time. It's the same thing with a wholesaler, except for that you don't need it protected the whole time because the wholesaler sells the deal to the buyer and protects your money in the process. So why is this important and how does this help you in this video? Well, I want to show you guys who you're talking to, when you need to talk to them, and what you need to be saying to them so that you understand who your target is. Because if you guys are trying to find more leads, you're trying to get more lending deals, you got to know who to talk to, and you have to make this decision. So I'll explain to you guys how I make the decision on earnest money specifically on who to talk to. These 9 times out of 10, in my experience, have been non-refundable transactions with a buyer. So, for the most part, when I'm doing my outreach and generating leads, I'm looking for wholesalers because wholesalers, you can protect the money and it's less about the wholesaler and more about the deal itself, more about the contracts, more about the protection. And that way, you know what to be thinking of. Now, on the other hand, if you decide, hey, I want to go talk to a buyer, right? I want to go work with a buyer, then A, you have to understand the risk, and B, you have to understand that you are no longer looking at the deals and the protection from the deal because it doesn't exist, right? What you're now doing is you are now vetting the buyer and putting all of your chips in with the buyer saying, I trust that they're going to be able to close this deal or that they have the money elsewhere to cover me. Now, this is a really tough topic because although it's way riskier with buyers, if you find a good buyer, a successful buyer, a buyer with a really good track record, then you might have on your hands a really good situation where you can make a whole bunch of money, and one good buyer can replace your income. One good wholesaler can replace your income too. Pretty cool, right? So, to close out the EMD lending type, here's what I want you to do. If you are reaching out to people and you are reaching out to a wholesaler, your goal should be to find wholesalers that are doing high volume deals and this is really important, have a track record of not only doing a lot of deals, but actually closing a lot of deals, right? Anybody can go lock up a contract for $100,000 more than the house is worth. That's not going to do anything. You need a wholesaler that's not only finding deals, but is consistently selling deals and has a track record to back it up. That's goal number 1 for EMD. Now, goal number 2 for EMD, if you would like, is working with buyers. I do not seek out buyers anymore, but I do have some really solid buyers that I work with. And here is what I would look for if you were going to try and find a buyer. I would be looking for somebody who buys a lot of properties, has a lot of real estate under their belt, potentially assets that you can use to protect your money, right, with some sort of a second lien or something like that. And here's the kicker, somebody that you just get along with that communicates really well, right? There's a whole bunch of different aspects to a borrower on a deal, but some of the top ones are people that you get along with and people that you can communicate with because people can't control whether or not a deal goes south, right? That's real estate. That's the world we live in. But people can control their response to those things, and you need to find people that are willing to do exactly that. So if you're somebody that's looking for earnest money deals to lend and fund so that you can start making some additional money, they are the easiest type of deal out of the 3 that we're going to talk about today to find. And they can be great, but you just need to know who you're talking to, right? So don't just start sending rogue messages to both wholesalers and buyers. Pick one. Think about what they're trying to do, what they're trying to accomplish, and solve their problem. If you can solve the problem of a wholesaler, if you can solve the problem of the buyer, whichever one of them you're trying to talk to, then you will be able to form relationships and establish the trust needed to start getting deals done. If you start reaching out to anybody and everybody saying vague, random things to them, then you'll get nothing done. Just like with most anything in the world of business, if you can niche down and focus on one thing at a time, you're going to go a lot further, a lot quicker. So for EMD, figure out if you want to talk to wholesalers or if you want to talk to buyers. Focus on that thing. Get really good at it. Get really good at how you talk to those people, what you say, figuring out how to solve their problems. And if you do that, you'll get yourself some EMD deals. Okay, now the next type of deal that we're going to talk about is the double close. Which kind of borrower needs double closing funds? Now, unlike EMD, where both buyers and wholesalers can utilize your services and your funds, double close, that is not the case. A double close is one person, and that is a wholesaler. Why? Well, by definition, a double close is two transactions, right? You got number one right here and number two. And fundamentally, what is happening on a double closing, right? Here's our first little contract, here's our second one, is that they're getting this thing under contract for, let's say, 500 grand, right? That's the first contract. And then they're selling it for 550,000. Keyword, they are selling it, right? They're not keeping the property. So if you're doing a double closing, what you're doing fundamentally is you're funding the first leg of the transaction. You're funding that $500,000. If you are funding that $500,000 and it is a double close, that means that you are helping them secure the first transaction so that they can turn around and go sell it, right? Therefore, it is not an end buyer. So if you are somebody who wants to find more double closing transactions, which a lot of people know, I love them a lot of people love them, they're harder to find, but you can make 1 to 2%, sometimes even more, in as little as an hour, as little as 30 minutes sometimes, depending on how fast the wires can go back and forth. They're a pretty crazy good deal, right? It's great to find. So if you're somebody that is looking for a double close, why is this so important? Because wholesalers are the only people that you can find those deals with, right? You cannot find those with buyers. So if you're talking to buyers, you are not getting any closer to double closing, right? You have to be talking to wholesalers. And it's incredibly important not only to know who to talk to, but to know what type of wholesalers you need to be talking to. Now, a couple leading indicators that you might have for where to find deals like this, once you know who to talk to, is looking in states where double closing might be more prominent. That might be states where there's more wholesale regulations. Now, this is not a lead generation video, right? This is my video to show you guys who to talk to on different types of transactions so that you have that understood first, but that can be a great indicator. So, why is this so cool? Well, because you remember, just before this, we were talking about EMD, where you work with both wholesalers and buyers, correct? Now, we're talking about double closing, where you work directly with wholesalers. Now, what does that mean? It's what exactly I do in my business that I am saying you guys can absolutely replicate and implement in yours, which is that when you talk to a wholesaler, you can get double trouble, right? You can get EMD deals, you can get double close deals, or you can get something even cooler. Might be starting to call this the Schroep method. I don't know. We'll see. You can lend EMD and do a double closing on the same transaction. Double trouble, right? You make money twice, and that is really cool. So if you're looking for EMD deals and you're talking to wholesalers, don't miss this, right? You got to pitch this too. You got to do both. Solve problems. If you can solve multiple of their problems in one place, you darn well better believe that they're going to want to keep working with you because they don't have to go to other places, right? They found somebody they can trust. Be that person. So, for double closes, you are talking to wholesalers. If you are talking to wholesalers, you can pitch both EMD and double close at the same time. You can make more money, you can make more friends, and it is a great way to get the ball rolling with your transactional lending. All right, now last up today, we've got the Morby method. Now, what the heck is that, and how can you be involved with lending on that transaction? But most importantly for this video, who the heck is doing that? Well, it is the inverse of the last one, right? On the Morby method, you are going to be working directly with buyers, right? That is who you're working with on these transactions, is a buyer. Now, what the heck is a Morby method? Well, this video is not for me to teach you the entire breakdown of a Morby method. It's to teach you who is actually doing it. But in general, what I will say is that if you have my classic $500,000 house example right here, a Morby method might be if somebody was coming in, a lender, let's say, for real estate investors, maybe a DSCR lender would be a typical example. They come in and say, hey, we are going to fund $400,000 of that 500. And you say, cool, I could then come up with the $100,000 down payment, but what if I got a little bit smarter and asked the seller, hey, you've got a bunch of equity in your house. Are you willing to seller carry or seller finance that portion of your equity to me to be able to get this transaction closed? Now, if they've been struggling to sell, especially, which is why these are becoming more prominent right now, if they've been struggling to sell, that might be something they're more open to, or if they just love a little bit of mailbox money. So the DSCR lender in this example is bringing $400,000, meaning there's another $100,000 that you have to bring to the table, but that difference, right, the $100,000 is getting seller financed. However, in a lot of transactions, you can't just immediately seller finance that, because this lender is going to require you to come up with this money ahead of time. So very similar to how a double closing works, you're going to bring this $100,000. If you're working with buyers on this type of deal, you're going to bring this $100,000 transactionally. It's going to be for less than a day, typically only a few hours, just like a double closing. But why is it called this instead of a double closing? Because it's a different type of transaction with a different person, right? That's the difference here. But you're going to bring this $100,000, and then immediately upon closing on the property, the seller finance portion or the seller carry portion is going to be carried out, and it's going to cover this $100,000 and pay you back your return. It's kind of like an infinite money glitch, pretty cool, and just like a double close, you have to come up with these liquid funds in order to do it, but only for like a few minutes, right? So that's the basic breakdown of a mortgage method, but what's most important to understand here is that buyers are the one doing these, not wholesalers. So very important to understand the differences between the three types of lending, knowing that EMD can be both types. Double closing is wholesalers, and the mortgage method, that's for buyers. So the most important thing to take away from this video is knowing who to talk to, when to talk to them, and what you are actually pitching to them so that you can work backwards. Don't go forwards and spend all of your time reaching out to people randomly, just throwing things at the wall, trying to see what'll stick. Figure out who to talk to first, figure out everything that they might need so that you can learn to solve their problem. So just a quick review, EMD you can do with buyers or wholesalers, either one. There's going to be some nuances with both, but you can do it with either. A DC, aka a double closing, is going to be with wholesalers. And then your mortgage method right here is going to be with buyers. Now, when you're looking at this list, remember that you can condense and translate the two together. Take advantage of which person you choose to reach out to and how you're reaching out to them. If you choose to reach out to a wholesaler, then you can do double close and EMD, right? You can pitch both of those things at the same time, kill two birds with one stone, solve multiple problems. If, however, you're working with the buyer, then you're going to do the double close and the mortgage. You can talk to them about both of those things at the same time as well, and it can be very, very lucrative. It is one of my favorite strategies. Oh, messed that up. It's EMD and mortgage. There's our buyer written up there. It's one of my favorite strategies, is give them the EMD and do the back-end closing. You can do it with both types. It's just slightly different depending on the methodology. But if you understand this, you will be able to go so much further, so much faster, because you're not just throwing things out there into space. Now, once you feel more confident on who you're talking to, the next and most important step in both a transactional lending business and any business for that matter is going and generating leads. If you are ready for that next step, you feel really good about who you're talking to, now you just got to figure out how to talk to them. I did an entire 4-hour masterclass for free breaking down my whole business so that you can see exactly how I do it from start to finish, and then just copy me the same way I did other people. So if you're at all interested in that and continuing to build your business, click the first link in the description.